Hi, I'm Professor Green, and we're going to come back and do the third part of this chapter of chapter 4. Let's go ahead and I'm going to move into slideshow mode. Last time when we finished part 2, I couldn't remember the pronunciation of Guanxi, but now it's morning time and I was able to refresh my memory and write the Guanxi, right, that we see, or the networks that we see throughout Asia. And there's a theory that there is efficiency that comes from these networks, from knowing who the vendors are, who the suppliers are, having relatives that are in the business, especially in the auto industry. We've seen that in Japan. And so as a reminder that that is an important term and can potentially move to help us move through economic progress. Let's go ahead and move into the third part, the third official part now. We're going to talk about language a little bit, just to make sure that we're all on the same page with the importance of language. First is we'll identify what the spoken language, what that is, and how that affects business. We're saying here that the nature of a language structures how we perceive the world very often, right? That there are certain sayings that we use, there are certain grammar. I know, for instance, in German, that the sentences can be quite complex, right? As you know, there's a tradition that some of the words are often long and complicated. And I think that is implemented in that Germany, it can be quite detailed oriented. They have no problem going to a certain extent to complete their thought, to complete their ideas. When I did German translations, very often it would take a quarter of the amount of text to do an additional piece for the German part. So if I had a page of English language words, when I translated that into German, it would be like a page and a quarter or so, because as I said, there's more words that they use in German for the same expressions in English, and how that's just one example of one language and how that shows up throughout the world. Countries with more than one spoken language often have more than one culture. Here in Chinese is the mother tongue of the largest number of people in the world, but even in China, there are smaller cultures. And then we also have a point here that English is the most widely spoken language in the world and is becoming the language, as we know, of international business. We also bring up the example of Belgium here, that there's Flemish and then there's French. And how that affects the economy is that there often is a fight between those two cultures. Even though they're in the same country, they can have very different cultures. Learning the local language is beneficial for business success. As we'll talk about more in this chapter, not necessarily required, but highly, highly recommended. Unspoken language. So these are the way people move, nonverbal clues. These are really also important in communication. Examples include facial expressions and hand gestures, as we've said already with the Russians, right? They don't like to smile on a regular basis, only when things are funny. And so when Americans smile all the time, right, like I often do when I was speaking to you, they wonder what is going on and if we're making fun of them. Hand gestures, the same thing, right? Here nowadays we use this thumbs up all the time, but in certain cultures in Asia, that is not very well respected, right? It's almost like using the middle finger that we do here in America. Personal space is also customary distance between two people. Latin America, they can very easily get very close to each other, a couple inches apart to have a conversation. But in Germany and the United States, we often leave a couple of feet in between individuals when we're talking to them. So many nonverbal clues are culturally bound and may be interpreted differently, resulting in misunderstandings. So a really big piece to going abroad and working abroad. Let's move on to education, because this is also a key part of a society and of culture. Formal education, how that is handled in a country. It teaches the language, conceptual, and technical skills that are indispensable in modern society. So it's a big piece of how the country develops. Educational opportunities can provide a competitive advantage and make a country more or less attractive for expanding businesses. Porter is one of the more famous theorists out of Harvard, and he talks a lot to international business. Here he says that Japan's excellent education system and explaining its post-war economic success. So they really invested heavily in making sure that the people had a good education, and that's why they've been so successful in many different industries, car industry, etc., after World War II. India, they say also, because they have such a nice base of education for educating engineers, partially due to the Jesuits. And so that in the future, they're predicting that India will actually do quite well because so many people are so well educated. The general education level of a country, key for your presentation, for your projects coming up, is a good indicator of the types of products also that might sell, or types of promotional materials that might be useful. An example here is if you have a country where many of the people are illiterate and can't read, that's probably not the best place to start selling books. Culture and business. So Hofstede's model, if you're not familiar with his model already, it's quite important. It's the main premise of this course. He said that society's culture affects values found in the workplace, right? So things that we do at home affect what shows up when we go to work. He isolated 5 dimensions that summarized different cultures. So the first one here is power distance. This is how the society, people are different in how they identify how people are different in physical and intellectually. So does the society place a lot of value on the differences between people, or they don't necessarily really care? We'll see in the next slide a chart showing different countries and people in countries that are high or low in power distance. But we'll see that, like New Zealand, for example, is one of the lowest countries on power distance, that they don't really put a lot of thought and value on people if they have a different physical or intellectual background or makeup. Individualism versus collectivism. We've already talked about this one a little bit in this course, right? If they are more individualistic, like we are here in the US, entrepreneurship minded, or if they're more about the collective. And this shows up very much in Asia, in Japan, and we'll see in a couple slides that is actually starting to shift. Uncertainty avoidance. We've also seen this already in this course, talking about Russia, how certain cultures really want to have an answer at the end of your conversation. They want to know where they're headed. They want their goals identified for the next 5-10 years, etc. But some cultures are okay with a lot of uncertainties. So that probably brings up ideas of Latin America, that we really see that places like Japan are very high when it comes to, they don't want a lot of uncertainty avoidance. Russia as well. Masculinity versus femininity. Where do women and where do men show up in society? Where do they show up in the workplace? Again, Japan shows up very high in that women are not necessarily included on a regular basis in the workplace. While in Sweden or in Scandinavia, that is the total opposite. And then the last one, so long-term versus short-term orientation. Do the people in society focus a lot on what's going to happen in the next 10, 20 years? Or are people more focused on what's happening just this year, maybe next year? And this has a lot of implications when you do financial planning. And we will see that the United States is a little bit lower when we talk about orientation, shorter term orientation, but places that are much higher are some of the Asian countries and Germany as well. We'll look at the chart here in just a minute and we'll go through those in detail. There's a move to add a 6th dimension that is still being proven, and this is indulgence versus restraint. Is a society more prone to be more indulgent? Do they want quick and free gratification, or are they have more restraint? Do they suppress their gratification? As if you ever go to Switzerland, you'll see that they're very good about restraint. The Swiss people, they don't buy very often more than they need. They're very frugal at times. They are happy to plan for years ahead, which kind of bleeds into short versus long-term orientation. And then there are different countries that really focus more on the quick win. So here's that chart that I was mentioning. As I said, power distance, right? How a society thinks about physical and intellectual differences. And right, New Zealand is very low. They're very laid back. India, right, still has a pretty big caste system and class system, despite that not being official any longer. It still very much exists in the society. Uncertainty avoidance. As I said, Japan, very high. They want to make sure that it's clear what the answer is going to be. Very low would be the UK. They're a lot more laid back when it comes to answers and making sure that the result at the moment is clear. Individualism, as I said, Australia, the United States is not on this portion of the graph, it's on the next page, but we'll just stick to this page just to go through these again and reiterate the ideas. Australia, very high on individualism, entrepreneurship. Low is Brazil. Low is also Japan, making sure that they're very much more about the family, about collectivism, about being a part of the community. Masculinity, again, are women in the workplace, right? Netherlands, as I said, Scandinavia and the Netherlands, there are a lot of women in the workplace. But when you talk about Japan, as I said, not so many women in the workplace. Long-term orientation, Japan, again, very high. Canada, coming up very low here, that they are very short-term oriented. And I said, there's another slide here with some more countries that I'll let you explore on your own. Let's talk a little bit more about Hofstede. Obviously, maybe you're already thinking about, wait, what about this exception or that exception? There are some critiques of Hofstede, and he's been around for a handful of decades, probably, I think he started in the early 80s, even the late 70s. He just becomes so popular with his ideas around international business. What can we critique about his ideas? First is that it assumes a one-to-one relationship between the culture and the nation state. So we say that, okay, all of China is all the same, or all of the Netherlands is all the same. And that's not necessarily the true, as we see with Switzerland, right? That they have 4 different languages and there are different cultures throughout the country. Fortunately, all those cultures for the most part get along. But as I said, in places like Belgium, they have Flemish and the French, and they don't necessarily get along with those 2 different cultures. Research may be culturally bound. So his study was in just the EU and the US. He's from the Netherlands, and so a lot of his work, and he worked for IBM. So we'll see in the next bullet slide here that they worked within a single industry and within one company. So he was working with mostly engineers at IBM. He hasn't really talked about other industries or about other organizations in his research. And then there's certain social classes excluded from the research that he didn't include, that he just focused on a handful of different social classes within the EU and within the United States. But at the end of the day, it is the main framework that we work from when we talk about culture. There are 2 other cultural frameworks. So if you particularly don't want to work with Hofstede, you're welcome to indulge yourself in some of these. The first one is GLOBE, the Global Leadership and Organizational Behavior Effectiveness. It identifies 9 cultural dimensions, and you'll see that there's a repetition here of a handful: power, distance, uncertainty, avoidance, etc. But then there are also things like performance or orientation and assertiveness that show up. So some other additional things that could be helpful. This is all about the leader's effectiveness in the context as well. So GLOBE really talks a lot about what is the actual situation where the leader is. And the next one is the World Value Survey, the WVS. This explores values and norms, how they change, and their impact on society and business. And a key part of this is how they change. So this includes now support for democracy and how democracy is evolving. We have more tolerance now for foreigners and more stress on well-being. And so this survey here brings up the idea that things are changing, and there are other factors that Hofstede didn't see in the 80s that are vital when we talk about culture. A big part of that, as I said, changing is the cultural change. And so let's just address that here for a minute. Cultural evolves. We all agree that over time, although changes in the value system can be slow and can be painful. For sure, right? If we often hear our grandparents saying, well, I, walked uphill in the snow to school, that they had, that they feel that their values maybe were a little bit different, or they had a different situation growing up. Social turmoil is an inevitable outcome of cultural change. That we see this in Japan, that people are becoming less collective and more individualistic. And then there's some kickback, right? That now, as a young executive, if you leave the firm to go to another firm, the people who were older or more used to this more collectivism idea, that they potentially might be angry. But the fact of the matter is that Japan and the culture is changing. Culture change is particularly common as countries become more economically stronger, as we see again with Japan. They become more global, they become more powerful, and they get exposed to other cultures, and those then influence the culture of the original country. As countries get richer, there's a shift from more traditional values to secular rationale values. And again, I see that also in Switzerland, that my grandparents were, much more traditional. Even though my grandmother did work, that was kind of rare. And now many women in Switzerland work all over the country. Globalization is creating a convergence of cultures, the convergence hypothesis. And that's the idea that we're kind of this melting pot of McDonald's everywhere, and that all these different cultures are kind of melting into one. The counter trend of some cultures is now that we're trying to re-emphasize their uniqueness. And again, talking my experience from Switzerland is that I see this actually more and more since I was a teenager. When I was a teenager in the 1990s, I didn't see so much about the, a nice hand knit embroidery, or the cows and the march of the cows coming down from the top of the mountain at the end of summer, the Swiss flag being everywhere. Now in 2022, I see those things throughout Switzerland. And so a lot of countries are really trying to reemphasize their uniqueness and talk about the things that they value and that they think work for them. And that really completes our chapter. I would really let your classmates talk about the managerial implications when they talk about their case study. But really important to, just talk about cultural literacy and competitive advantage, how it's really important for managers to develop literacy. There's a connection between culture and national competitive advantage, and there's a connection between culture and ethics and decision-making. Being aware of ethnocentric behavior, believe in the purity of our own culture, right? Very important that we don't go there. And then how the value systems and norms of a country influence the cost of doing business in that country. And so, right, as I said, the guanxi, important because there are some efficiencies that come with that. But then there's other things like going to the Middle East or Latin America, when there are issues about time and not being on time, that can really hurt an American manager when he has his schedule set up so precisely for a visit, for example. The influence the ability of firms to establish a competitive advantage sometimes because they don't necessarily understand how the country works. And the connection suggests which countries are likely to produce the most viable competitors, and has implications for the choice of countries in which to locate production facilities and to do business. And that, again, will be part of your big project. All right. So in summary, this chapter, we have explained what is meant by the culture of society, identified the forces that lead to differences in social culture, identified the business and economic implications of differences in culture, recognize how differences in social culture influence values in business, right? Because lots of interesting things about culture, but we're tying it back to business for this course. And we've demonstrated an appreciation for the economic and business implications of cultural change, because those are ever present. Great. Thank you so much for joining me. And I look forward to seeing you in chapter 6. We skip chapter 5 because you take a whole course on ethics, but I will see you in chapter 6.